I'm Joel Wizansky. Welcome to the video program notes for the Goldberg variations. This is basically just a slightly more elaborate version of the sort of talk I would normally give at a performance before a particularly long or involved piece. But in this particular case of this extraordinary work, because it is an entire program unto itself, and anything that I could say really meaningful about it in preparation for it would take more than a couple of minutes, I decided to simply sever the pre-programmed talk from the program and make it available for you in this format so that you can watch it and peruse it at your leisure. So, the Goldberg variations, firstly, the story of the work and its nickname, which may or may not be true, is that there was apparently a Russian ambassador who had in his employ a young pianist by the name of Goldberg. And when he came to Leipzig, he would take young Goldberg to Bach for lessons. Now, it also happens that this ambassador had insomnia, and part of young Goldberg's duties were to come and play for him during the night when he couldn't sleep. So at some point, the ambassador came up with the idea of commissioning Bach to write him a special piece just for Goldberg to play in his sleepless nights. And Bach's response to this was this extraordinary set of variations. So this story appears in a biography of Bach published about 50 years after his death. And so its authenticity is uncertain. We can't really know for sure if the story is true or not. Nonetheless, the nickname Goldberg variations adhered to the piece from that story, and it has stuck ever since. So the piece was actually somewhat unusually published during Bach's lifetime, but simply under the title Aria with 30 diverse variations. So before I talk about the overall shape of this incredible journey of these 30 variations, I thought I'd say just a few words about the starting point, which is the aria. So the aria serves as, of course, the theme for the variations, and it is in the form of a saraband, which is one of the standard Baroque dances that you'd find in virtually any Bach suite of dances. And it's the one in 3/4 time, very kind of slow and stately. Now, to write a great set of variations, you don't have to have a great theme, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And in this particular case, the aria itself is just a gem. Certainly, I would say if he had simply written the aria and this were one of the sarabands in one of the suites, we would probably say this is among the most beautiful of all the Bach sarabands. The form of the variations, or the technique that Bach uses, is basically using the harmonic structure, and particularly the bass line of this theme, as the foundation for the variations. This is something that you'll really be aware of more or less unconsciously. It's just something you hardly even have to think about. But there is one point about that shape that I do want to point out to you that might be something that you could listen for as you journey through the piece. The structure of the piece is very simple. It's in the most basic binary form, which means there are two halves. Each is repeated. Each half has two 8-bar phrases. So 32 bars, 4 phrases. First one, second one, repeated. Third one, fourth one, those two repeated. So very straightforward. Each of these 4 phrases, and they're all in every case very clearly delineated and separated by cadences. Each one is in a different key, and that's something that you can perhaps hear. So the first phrase is in the home key of the piece, G major, a simple, bucolic, tranquil, lovely, graceful. The second phrase modulates to D major, which is closely related key. Very similar in spirit, but perhaps just a little bit more forward going, a little more sense of evolution, of forward motion. So similar character, but just a little bit more adventuresome. The third phrase is the most distinct because it is in E minor, the relative minor key, and of course that stands out. So I'll play you the second half of that phrase because it's very distinctive. So obviously that introduces an element of melancholy, of sadness into the work. And then that proceeds directly into the fourth phrase, which modulates in this beautifully subtle way back to the home key of G. And there, so that has a wonderful sense of resolution and homecoming. So that underlying structure will be in some form throughout the variations, the two major, major, minor, major, with the exception of the three variations that are in minor, and then it's reversed, then it becomes exactly reversed, minor, minor, major, minor. But in every case, the third phrase sort of stands out. And of course, the variations have tremendously varied character. So particularly that minor phrase in a more animated variation, the character might be sort of mischievous and playful, or in a dramatic variation, it might be more fiery and defiant. So there's a lot of variety, but always it will stand out in some way. So that's sort of an underlying unifying element that you can perhaps listen for. Otherwise, though, the variations are extraordinarily diverse, as promised in the title. There's a certain irony that underlies this piece that Bach apparently really did not care for theme and variations as a form, because of exactly this. He felt that the repetitiveness of the repeated harmonic structure was a bit tedious. And in fact, there are relatively few examples of theme and variations among Bach's works. There's, of course, the great Chaconne, but there you just have a 4-bar phrase repeated over and over again. But by and large, it's something that he apparently seemed to avoid. So there's certainly a certain sort of cosmic irony in the fact that this form that he did not particularly like, he undertook it for this particular project, feeling it was appropriate, and produced one of the great masterworks of Western musical civilization, and then said, okay, that's enough for that, and that was it for theme and variations. So his solution to this problem, though, of the potential repetition was, as I say, to incorporate as much diversity as possible and contrast within the variations. And you'll hear there are some variations where there's sort of one technique where the variations kind of evolve gradually from one into the next and sort of a linear progression. This is not that. The variations, there's not a single case where one flows directly into the next one. Each one is in a different tempo. And in fact, there are rarely two in a row that are even in the same meter. This sort of presents an interesting way to think about the piece, that in a way you could look at it not as this large, solid object, but as a series of little pieces, as 30 little vignettes, and you could listen to them as just as little individual stories, the way you might, listen to 24 Chopin preludes or something, where each is its own little world. Now, this does not mean that they are just thrown together sort of randomly one after the next. Hardly that, because in fact there is a very, very firm and complex structure to how these variations are laid out. And that's what I think I want to talk to you about next, to give you a sense of help you follow through the piece. So there are 30 variations. There are basically 3 sort of categories that they divide up into. The first is a series of canons, and I will discuss each of these in turn. Every third variation, beginning with the third, is a canon. So the third, the sixth, and so forth, with the exception of the 30th, which is like the last one is a special surprise. The second category is what basically virtuoso variations. Virtuoso written in a very ostentatious, clear way to sort of show off the technique of the performer. And the third category is basically everything else. We tend to people refer to those as character variations. And those are all each different from another, and they tend to sort of encompass a variety of Baroque dance forms or other forms and techniques of Baroque composition. So it forms a sort of encyclopedia of Bach's language, or at least that which could be expressed on a keyboard instrument. So the first group are the canons. A canon is a simple polyphonic form where you have two voices which play the same tune, one following after the next. So one starts and the other comes in and plays basically the same melody. So the most simple form of a canon is familiar to everyone in the form of a round. And when you sing a round, I start row, row, row your boat. You come in row, row, row your boat. You start on the same note that I started on. So that's a simple canon. And because the difference between my note and your note is they're the same note, so we call that a unison. So that is called a canon at the unison, is the technical term for it. So that's the most simple form that everybody knows. But of course, you don't have to do it that way. You can have the next voice come in at a different interval from the first one. So if it could come in a step higher or lower, that would be a canon at the second, and so forth. So this is a very strict progression, and it's clearly labeled in the piece. As I say, every third variation, starting with the third, is a canon, and they progress. Begins with a canon at the unison, then a canon at the second, then a canon at the third, and so forth, all the way up to a canon at the ninth, which would be the 27th variation, and then the 30th, again, is an exception. So those are, as I said, that's the most formal sequence. It's very clearly labeled and very fixed. So some of these, of course, are easier to hear than others. As an example, the canon at the second, you might hear the two voices sort of chasing each other down the hill. And so forth. Now, the complicating factor is most of them, in fact, all of them but one, have a third voice which is an independent bass line. So what you're actually going to hear is so that gives it sort of a full texture. Another one that's easy to hear because the voices are very close together in time and sort of winds up sounding like a dog chasing its tail is the canon at the sixth. So you can hear the two voices. That's a fun one. That's clear. Some of them are, as I say, a little less difficult. The one that doesn't have a bass line is the canon at the ninth. So there you'll just hear the two hands against each other. That's in some ways the clearest to hear. There's also another trick, which is a couple of the canons are inverted, which means when the second voice comes in, instead of playing what the first voice plays, it plays a mirror image. So, for example, the first of those is the canon at the fourth. So you hear the one voice. And then the other voice answers. So going in the opposite direction. So it gives the feeling of sort of a kind of vectors going in different against each other. Or another one, the variation, the canon at the fifth, which is also the first minor variation. So you'll hear. So what one goes down, the other goes up. So that's another of the various tricks you'll hear. So those, as I say, that's the most clearly defined category. Now the next category, slightly less, they're less formally defined, but still quite clear, is what we call, or as I say, these virtuoso variations. In the program listing, which I will show you later on, I refer to these as toccata variations, and that's just sort of a nickname I coined because a toccata is a Baroque piece in sort of brilliant keyboard style, specifically for harpsichord or organ, that shows off. So these are not strict toccatas. obviously, but they have a little bit that quality, so I give them that nickname. And these are not quite as consistent as the canons, but almost. And in fact, there's basically the pattern that runs through the piece for the groups of three variations from the second one, with the exception of the first and the last, let's put it that way. The pattern is there will be one character variation, one toccata, virtuoso variation, and then a canon. And that applies from variation 4 all the way through variation 27. They occur in that sequence. The only exceptions, the first group, there are, I think, 2 character variations and then the canon. And the last group, as it's sort of revving up to the big finale, has 2 virtuoso variations. And then the final variation, which we'll talk about. So the general pattern of these virtuoso variations is they become increasingly elaborate as they go along. So you'll see as they go along, they become kind of more and more ostentatious, in a way kind of outlandish in the sort of tricks and jumps and trills and turns and running notes. It's really among probably the most virtuoso writing that we have in Bach for the keyboard. In connection with that is another important aspect of this piece, that it was written very expressly for a harpsichord with 2 keyboards. So a basic harpsichord could just have one keyboard, just like a modern piano. But a fancy harpsichord will have 2, one on top of the other, like you'd see on an organ. And there are only a handful of pieces that Bach specifically intended for dual manual harpsichords, as they're called. And this is one of them. And this is the only one where he actually indicates at the top of each variation specifically for 1 keyboard or for 2 keyboards. And these virtuoso variations are mostly for 2 keyboards. So as a result of that, of course, there are certain things that you can do with 2 keyboards that you can't with 1. And there's a certain amount of jumping and hand crossing, and that's you can still do on 2 keyboards. But when it gets tricky is there'll be certain passages, you can write passages, of course, where the 2 hands are going in opposite direction and just sort of cross like ships in the night. And likewise, you can have passages where the 2 hands are basically in the same part of the keyboard because each has its own keyboard. So those, of course, become quite problematic to do, to render on the piano, and it requires a certain amount of kind of navigation, and I think of it as like air traffic control, just try to getting the 2 hands in the right places as needed. It also will result in occasionally passages that look sort of like this, where you will probably be inclined to ask a very natural question, why doesn't he just play like a normal person? And the reason for that is, of course, you have a decision to make in playing this piece on the piano, to what extent you want to keep the original distribution as it's written, and to what extent you need to kind of redistribute between the 2 hands to make it more practicable on the piano. My general approach is I try as much as possible to keep the original distribution, because that sort of acrobatic virtuoso element is very much a part of the piece. As we've seen, it's very sort of intrinsic to the nature of the piece. So to the experience, you have to kind of feel that to have the experience of playing it, and also I think the experience of listening to it. Now there may be a handful of places where it just becomes so awkward and impossible that I might switch hands for a few notes here or there. But of course I would never admit that. Now the third set of variations is basically everything else. And as I say, this is sort of a motley collection of various Baroque dances or genres. Now here we enter into the realm more of conjecture, because they're not, some of them are labeled, most of them are not. So it's just a matter of sort of interpretation. And here I will introduce you to the program format that I'm using for this performance. So you will see here in this program I've listed all the variations. My thinking is rather to just say, okay, here's 30 variations, have at it, good luck. I've decided to list them all and characterize them. So you'll see the canons labeled. Those are the regular ones. And then the virtuoso variations that I call toccatas. Now, all of the others are labeled some way or another. So the indications that are in italics, and I'll attach a copy of this. I'll just put it at the end of the video, and of course you'll have it at the concert. So the ones that I marked in italics, those are labeled by Bach. So those are fairly clear cut. One of the most obvious, for example, is the overture. That's variation 16, which is so it's exactly the half point of the piece. So pretty clearly cuts the work in half. It starts, the French overture is this very noble kind of introductory type of fanfare with full of dotted rhythm. Very regal. So very clearly he's saying, okay, this is the beginning of part two of the second half of the piece. Also, an overture generally has two parts. One is that slow, dignified part, and then comes a fugue. And Bach very cleverly incorporates both of them. So the first half of the variation is the slow part, and the second part is the fast fugue. So it's sort of like two variations in one. So the other ones that are labeled, number 10, the fuguetta, is exactly what it says. It's like a little miniature fugue. The voices come in just like a little fugue. The seventh variation, tempo di giga, that's a jig. It's actually a French jig with sort of a snappy rhythm. That's clearly defined. Now the others, as I say, we enter sort of the realm of conjecture. The first two I think of as sort of in the style of an invention, like a two-part invention, and in the style of a trio sonata. The first variation, I don't know, could be considered a virtuoso variation. I'm kind of on the fence about that. Again, it's a matter of interpretation. I've used the term Ricercar. That's a sort of fancy Baroque, obscure contrapuntal form, and I'm using it probably wrongly, but to indicate in this a couple of variations where there's these very quick, close imitations, almost one per bar. So in the first one, variation 4, the voice is sort of shooting back and forth at each other. So there are a couple that have that style. And then there are two variations that are pretty clearly in what we would call arioso style. And these are slow variations, very lyrical, ornate style of a Bach aria that will, I'm sure, be in a way quite familiar because it's used in some of Bach's most beautiful and famous pieces. And it's also notable because the style is very much melody and accompaniment. Almost all these forms are in some way contrapuntal. And sometimes it can be a little confusing because the ones that, it's easy, sometimes I remember when I first hearing the piece, some of the variations that I said, oh, that's a canon. Like the second one, which I call the trio sonata. I say, oh, that's a canon, right? The second voice answered. Well, it turns out it's only a canon for 4 bars. It goes in, so it's a fake out. So there are a lot like those. The two arioso variations, completely different, very clear. It's just a melody in the right hand, accompaniment in the left hand. So they really stand out in that way. The second one being the 25th variation, which is the third minor variation, which is actually marked adagio, and which is really kind of the expressive center of the work, and a piece of extraordinary pathos and also very almost kind of shocking chromaticism. So those, as I say, that basically forms, it will be alteration of those three genres, the potpourri of canon variations, of character variations, the virtuoso variations, increasingly elaborate, and then the canons, which are, again, in character and style, again, quite varied. Now, and that brings us to the last variation, which should be a canon, but it isn't, and instead Bach sort of adds a really fun surprise. The last variation is something called a Quodlibet. So if you know your Latin, that basically means something like whatever you want or what you will. And it means that in sort of in the sense of potpourri. And this is a style that's still occasionally used, and it's very fun. And what it entails is using popular songs, just popular melodies, folk songs that everybody knows, and mixing them into the piece with whatever the material is. So this last variation, it's actually quite majestic, and you'll hear the sort of stateliness of the harmonic progression. But mixed into it, there are, and it is known, there are a couple of actual folk songs. Now, unless you are an 18th century German, you may not recognize these folk songs. But they still have enough of sort of natural character when you hear. I don't know, to my ear, that the actual folk song is something about a mother complaining to his son that he never comes to visit, and the son responding, "Turnips and cabbage have driven me away." But to me that sounds, I don't know, at least somehow vaguely similar enough to hot cross buns that you can feel that it has this popular element to it. So it's a sort of relatively rare element of humor in Bach. We don't think of Bach as a humorous composer in the way of like Beethoven or Haydn, but this is an element where he really was having kind of fun while at the same time rounding out this whole adventure in a quite grand way. And the score ends with the very simple but wonderfully profound words, Aria da Capo e fine. In other words, you come to the end, you go all the way back to the beginning, play the aria one more time, and you're done. So this, of course, has an extraordinary effect because you're going back to this aria that you heard over an hour before, and hearing it, having gone through this whole journey of the variations, and then coming home again. It's an extraordinary effect and is sort of experienced differently by everybody. But one thing that's certain is it feels very differently the second time than it did the first. So that's, I hope, just a general guideline to help you listen to the piece. Now this and certainly the program listings, it's totally optional. There will not be a test. Everyone listens in their own way, so you're free to ignore it completely. Everyone listens differently. If you want to put the program under your chair and sit back and listen, that's fine. For some people, following that guideline will help them. It's totally up to you. But hopefully this little guide will give you something to listen for as you experience this extraordinary piece. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the concert.